When Kingda Ka debuted at Six Flags Great Adventure in 2005, not only was its record-breaking speed and height impressive, but so were its operations that allowed for smooth and consistent launches over and over again, which kept the long line of guests constantly moving. Upon its grand opening, Kingda Ka operated with 4 trains in service by uniquely using 4 different load bays in its enormous station building. It was truly a spectacle to watch, and I'm thrilled I was able to experience it. Kingda Ka operated with all 4 trains until the end of 2010. For the 2011 season, it was altered to a 3-train service where every train cycled through a single load bay, more like traditional roller coasters. In this video, we'll take a deep dive into the short-lived 4-train operations at Kingda Ka. We'll analyze how it worked, what was great about it, what its major drawbacks were, and why the park reduced it to a 3-train service that was in place for most of the ride's career. If you enjoy this video as it plays, I kindly ask for your support by clicking the like button, as it helps the channel greatly against the YouTube algorithm. Kingda Ka was built by Intamin, which for over 2 decades has been the amusement industry's most daring ride manufacturer. The company often debuts a brand new ride model and continuously iterates on the product with future installations at other parks. This is how Intamin improved the design of their hydraulic launch coaster as seen in Kingda Ka, as well as how the dual station setup that ran 4 trains was created. Intamin unveiled their hydraulic launch coaster in 2002 with Accelerator at Knott's Berry Farm. Accelerator operates with up to 2 trains and does so with a single station. Each train unloads and boards new riders, then is launched directly from the station. Once the train rides over the top hat and flags a sensor near the bottom of the following drop, the next train can roll into the station to unload and board new riders. Overall, while it allows for 2-train operations, it's not a very optimal setup since trains are launched directly from the station, which delays when the next train can enter the station to board new riders. In 2003, Intamin debuted the predecessor to Kingda Ka, Top Thrill Dragster at Cedar Point, which stood as the world's tallest and fastest roller coaster for just 2 years, until Kingda Ka ate its records. I still remember the anger and drama with that. What a fun time to be an enthusiast. Anyway, Dragster was built to have much faster operations than Accelerator. For one, the launch was separated from the station, meaning trains were dispatched into the launch, allowing the next train to enter the station much sooner to board new riders, since it didn't have to wait for the train ahead to launch and crest the top hat before proceeding forward. Dragster also loaded 2 trains at a time, meaning trains would be dispatched to the launch in pairs, allowing 2 trains to be launched back to back in quick succession. The ride also employed a separate unload station where 2 trains could unload riders, and was meant to run with 6 trains on the track. But unfortunately, due to a design error with the final brake run, along with the failure to implement a radical method of multi-move, which would have advanced all 6 trains completely simultaneously, it made sense to only run Dragster with 5 trains, which thankfully still allowed the ride to operate at its maximum capacity, although less optimally, with the launch occurring about every 60 seconds. In 2004, Intamin debuted their 3rd hydraulic launching roller coaster, Storm Runner at Hershey Park. It also operates with 2 trains like Accelerator, but Intamin improved on its operations by dispatching trains into a separate launch area like on Top Thrill Dragster, and by also implementing a dual station setup which allowed the ride's 2 trains to unload and load new riders simultaneously. With the ride's short duration, 1 train can pull into the left station to begin its unload and load process, while the train in the right station finishes the boarding procedure and is dispatched to the launch track. This helps speed up dispatches since the second train can start its load procedure instead of stacking behind the other train and wasting time. For Kingda Ka, there was a need to dispatch as many trains into the circuit as possible to keep its long line of guests constantly moving. With another iteration, Intamin combined the operational methods of Top Thrill Dragster and Storm Runner, creating dueling stations where each station platform could unload and load 2 trains at a time. This allowed for launches to occur just about every 60 seconds like on Top Thrill Dragster, while using only 4 trains instead of 6, which greatly reduced the cost of purchasing all of Kingda Ka's trains compared to Dragster, as well as reducing the cost and effort of maintaining the ride's trains since there were 2 less units to maintain. It also allowed for all 4 trains to unload and load with riders simultaneously. Ideally, 2 trains would be dispatched into the ride course while the other 2 trains unloaded and loaded with new riders in the opposite station. Then once the second train and the pair on the ride course was launched, and the track switch in front of the station repositioned to the next station, the other 2 trains would dispatch. I'll go much more into detail on this later later in the video. To continue with the rest of the video, you'll first need to know what a block zone is. For those of you who are unfamiliar, a block zone is a section of ride that only one train may occupy. At the end of a block zone is a method to stop a train in case the block zone ahead is still occupied. This is the safety system that prevents roller coaster trains from colliding into one another. Kingda Ka's block zones were quite interesting with the dual station. Starting with the station building, the station track on the inside of the ride closer to the parking lot was known as the left station, and the opposite station track closer to the Golden Kingdom was the right station. Within the two stations, the forward load bays were known as position 1, and the rear load bays were known as position 2. Thus, the 4 station block zones were left station 1, left station 2, right station 1, and right station 2. For reference, right station 1 was the only station used when the ride reduced to 3 train operations. And while not block zones, there were 2 track switches, with one at the entrance of the station known as Station Entrance Track Switch 1, and one at the exit of the station known as Station Exit Track Switch 2. Following was the transfer block, which was the hold position before the launch track, where the second train in each pair would stop for the first train to launch, as well as where trains would be transferred on and off the ride storage tracks. Next was the launch block, which was the actual launch track that ended just past the crest of the top hat. Last was the brake area block, which ran from just past the crest of the top hat to the end of the brake run right before left and right station 2. All in all, Kingda Ka had 7 block zones to run its 4 trains. Sort of. The ride really had 5 of its 7 block zones active at a time. This was because the dual station essentially divided the ride into 2 separate coasters that ran 2 trains each. Let's say the 2 trains from the right station are dispatched into the circuit, while the other 2 trains are loading in the left station. This means the 2 track switches are positioned to the right station, leaving the left station disconnected from the circuit, meaning only 5 block zones are actually active. And not to make things more confusing, but only 4 block zones were really active at a time, as from 2005 to 2010, the brake area block didn't technically function as its own block zone. More on that in just a second. To make everything make more sense, let's walk through how the ride would dispatch trains. Typically, the green and teal trains were paired together and operated on the right station track, and the orange and blue trains were paired together and operated on the left station track. Let's say we start with green and right station 1, teal and right station 2, blue and left station 1, and orange and left station 2. The right station trains are loaded and ready to go, so they are dispatched first while the left station trains just begin loading new riders. The station exit track switch is also positioned to the right station, permitting the right station trains to dispatch. Green train would dispatch first and advance towards the transfer track, while teal train remained in right station 2. Once green train fully exited right station 1, teal train would dispatch from right station 2 into right station 1. Green train would advance through the transfer track and then park in the launch block, which freed up the transfer track for the teal train to continue moving through right station 1 and into the transfer track. Once the teal train fully exited right station 1 and the station entrance track switch was positioned to the right station, the operator could launch the green train. Green would launch and ride up the top hat. Once it flagged a sensor at the crest of the top hat, which I believe was known as the tower exit prox, teal train would advance to the launch block and park. Green train would slow in the brake run and head towards the station. It would ride over the station entrance track switch and roll through station 2. Once green train fully exited right station 2 and was fully back in right station 1, the operator was permitted to launch the teal train. Note that the control system forced the operator to wait until the first train in the pair cleared the right station 2 block to launch the next train, and not for the brake area block to clear, which is why the brake area block wasn't actually a block zone. We'll talk even more about that later in the video. Anyway, teal train would launch and ride up the top hat. When it flagged the prox at the crest of the tower, the station exit track switch would automatically reposition to the left station. The track switch would never reposition before the second train cleared the top hat in case it rolled back, as following a rollback, the train would need to return to the station platform it came from. The track switch would lock in place as the teal train was slowing in the brake run of the Camelback, which permitted the left station to begin dispatching into the circuit, which started the process all over again. Blue train would dispatch from left station 1 and towards the launch block. Once it exited left station 1, orange train would begin dispatching from left station 2. As the 2 trains were proceeding to the launch and transfer blocks, teal train would pass through the station entrance track switch and re-enter right station 2. Once it completely passed through the track switch would automatically reposition to the left station track. This was important as the next train from the left station could not launch until this track switch locked in place with the left station track. If trains from the left station were dispatched quickly enough, both trains would be parked in the launch and transfer track waiting for the station entrance track switch to reposition to the left station. If not, the first train in the pair would launch as soon as the second train had exited left station 1. Anyway, blue train would be launched once both the orange train exited left station 1 and the station entrance track switch repositioned to the left station. Once it crested the top hat, orange train would move up to the launch block and park where it would wait for the blue train to finish the circuit, ride through left station 2, and fully enter left station 1. It would then be permitted to launch, and once it crested the top hat, the station exit track switch would automatically reposition to the right station. Typically, by the time the second train in a pair launched, the opposite station platform would have trains loaded with new riders, harnesses checked, and ready for dispatch. So they would actually have to wait for the train on the course to crest the top hat, and then for the station exit track switch to reposition. Once the track switch locked in place, the attendants on platform would get green dispatch lights, and they would dispatch the right side trains into the circuit. This process would repeat over and over again, and it yielded very high ridership numbers, as long as the coaster didn't break down. Loading 2 trains while the other 2 ran the circuit gave ample time for attendants to prepare trains for dispatch. The first train in a pair would return to the station a minute ahead of the second train, giving it plenty of time to load while the second train ran its cycle and then returned to the station. Then the second train would park in the station as the first train of the next pair began its launch sequence, meaning it still had over a minute to prepare for the next dispatch, which was plenty of time for Ka's rather small 18-passenger trains. So compared to running 3 trains through a single load station, it was a breeze to achieve the ride's theoretical capacity with all 4 trains using all 4 load stations. In most cases, the ride crew would have a pair of trains ready to dispatch before the coaster would even permit them to. If the ride crew dispatched the next pair of trains as soon as the station exit track switch repositioned, it yielded a dispatch about every 2 minutes. But even if they didn't dispatch as soon as they could, maybe 10 seconds later at most, it still didn't really slow down the rate at which trains were launched. When dispatching at the minimum dispatch interval, the second train in a pair would park on the transfer track before the first train could be launched, as at the minimum dispatch interval, the first train would still be waiting on the station entrance track switch to reposition. But if the next pair of trains was dispatched maybe only 10 seconds after the minimum dispatch interval, the station entrance track switch would reposition at the same time the second train in the pair exited the front station block, allowing the first train to begin the launch sequence as the second train was still rolling up to the transfer block. So the system allowed for a little wiggle room to launch trains at the minimum launch interval, even if a pair of trains wasn't dispatched right at the minimum dispatch interval.
And your shoulder parts have been released. Welcome back to train. How about that ride?
Intamin has always advertised that Kingda Ka was theoretically capable of doing 1,400 riders per hour with its 18-passenger trains. And the funny thing is that's technically not correct, which falls in line with many other Intamin coasters from the 2000s. 1,400 riders per hour is only based on how quickly the launch system is able to reset and launch another train, which is every 45 seconds. And this yields 80 launches an hour, which is also confusing because 80 trains times 18 riders is 1,440 riders per hour, but whatever. In actuality, the ride's block zones prevented trains from launching as quickly as the launch system could reset, which is what led to the ride being able to launch trains every 60 seconds, as that was the time needed for the rear station block to become unoccupied, or for the station entrance track switch to reposition. Now, I don't have the exact timings due to a lack of videos with 4 train operations, but I always found in my experiences that the 2 trains in each pair launched closer together than the second train of a pair and the first train of the next pair would. Sometimes the second train in a pair could launch less than 60 seconds after the first in a pair, and then there would be about 65 to 70 seconds between the second launch of a pair and the first launch of the next pair. All in all, Kingda Ka's actual theoretical capacity with 4 trains was 60 launches an hour, with the launch occurring roughly every 60 seconds, yielding 1,080 riders per hour, which was exactly the same as Dragster's theoretical capacity. Operationally, the ride crew had a target to launch 54 trains with a launch about every 67 seconds, yielding 972 riders per hour. Kingda Ka could also operate with 3 trains, where one station ran 2 trains and the other station ran 1 train. With 3 trains, 56 trains could theoretically be launched an hour, with a launch roughly every 64 seconds, yielding 1,008 riders per hour. Operationally, with 3 trains, the ride crew had a target of 42 launches an hour, with a launch about every 86 seconds, yielding 756 riders per hour. The ride could also run with 2 trains, I believe in 2 different methods. One where each station track would operate 1 train, just like Storm Runner at Hershey Park, but I've personally never seen this and don't believe that was ever opted for. The only way I know of in which the park ran 2 trains was where one station track operated both trains and still dispatched them in a pair. I believe this method was used to avoid cycling the track switches, which could actually cause downtime. The default station for Kingda Ka has always been the right station, as this side has a ramp that leads to the station which accommodates ADA guests, whereas the left station requires using stairs to access it. So whenever the ride ran 2 trains, it always utilized the right station. With 2 trains, 39 trains could theoretically launch an hour, with a launch roughly every 92 seconds, yielding 702 riders per hour. Operationally, the ride crew had a target of 29 launches an hour, with a launch about every 124 seconds, yielding 522 riders per hour. And of course, the ride could also just run 1 train, but before 2011, that was extremely rare. When the ride ran 2 trains as opposed to 3 or 4, you could really feel the slowdown in the speed of the queue. Ka's 4 train operations were more like 2 train operations on a regular coaster with longer trains, and 2 train operations at Ka were like a normal coaster running just 1 train. Most parks in today's times would not build a roller coaster in the way Kingda Ka was, where there were 4 station positions. That's because each position required 2 ride attendants, so a total of 8 attendants were needed to run all 4 trains, whereas most of the coasters at Great Adventure have always operated with just 2 attendants checking restraints. Now thankfully, the park seemed to prioritize the staffing of Kingda Ka, so in most of my visits where I rode it between 2007 and 2010, it ran with all 4 trains. Now I've also experienced it when it ran 3 trains, which still allowed the line to move decently fast, but I always found 2 train operations to be completely miserable. Thankfully, 2 train operations in the ride's later years through a single station was much faster, and in a sense, the original 2 train operations using one side of the station was a downside with the ride's original 4 train operations, as the ride physically didn't have the ability to cycle 2 trains through a single load position. The track switches were also a downside, since they introduced moving track pieces to the ride, which also meant they could be a reason for downtime. There were many times where the track switches wouldn't work properly and not align with the track they tried to position to, especially when it got too hot or too cold outside, which would cause everything to expand or shrink. For some reason, the station entrance track switch was always more troublesome than the station exit track switch. Maybe because the station entrance track switch was built at a slight downward angle, where the station exit track switch was built completely flat. Compared to Top Thrill Dragster, which had no moving track pieces, the moving track switches on Ka were actually a drawback because of the downtime they introduced. And while I always found Ka's dual station to more consistently dispatch trains, as well as be more visually appealing than Dragster's linear setup, the moving track pieces are just the first of several reasons why Dragster's setup was ultimately better. Another drawback with the dual stations was how slow the line moved once you reached the station. Before reaching the station, the line moved at the rate of 1 train launching every 1 minute, but when you reached the station, you got in line for just 1 of the 4 trains, meaning your line now moved at the rate of your particular train launching once every 4 minutes. Whereas with Dragster, you queued up for 1 of 2 trains that loaded in the station, meaning you were waiting at a rate of 1 train launching every 2 minutes instead of the crazy 4 minutes on Ka. If Ka's station was crowded, waiting at each train could take forever, especially for the front row, so I absolutely never bothered waiting for it back then. Thankfully, the ride crew were pretty good about not flooding the station and only filling each train's queue with 1 or 2 train loads of waiting guests. The left station was usually the go-to since most people queued up for the more immediate right side station when there wasn't a split attendant to direct guests to either side of the station. This next reason is why I think Dragster's setup was ultimately better no matter what. Since each train on Ka had a separate queue for it in the station, if one train was ever pulled from service due to some sort of mechanical issue, the queue of riders waiting for that train no longer had a train to service them. I've seen this happen several times and have probably firsthand experienced it, but when this would happen, the line of riders waiting for that train would have to vacate that particular queue and start over again in another train. Or sometimes the ride crew would have that queue cross the train that they were waiting for into the central exit area, where they would then board the train on the opposite platform from the exit. But either way, it was still a terrible thing if one train had to be pulled from service. And with all of these reasons combined, while I still prefer Ka's dual station at heart, Dragster's setup was fundamentally better, even if it also had its flaws and required more trains to operate on the track. For the 2011 season, a major alteration was made to Kingda Ka, which allowed the ride to run at about the same capacity as with 4 trains by cycling 3 trains through a single load position. To do this, a new operational mode was added called load/unload front only mode, whereas the original mode was called normal mode. To make it work, the brake area block received another set of drive tires right before the station entrance track switch. The new drive tires were fixed in place and capable of stopping each train in conjunction with the magnetic brakes, which brought each train to a crawl. The reason the brake area wasn't truly a block in the past is because the control point at the end of the brake area, which would actually stop each train, were these drive tires right before the rear station positions. The original drive tires were not fixed in place like the new drive tires right before the track switch, and actuated up and down to more smoothly roll trains into the station building. Since they actuated, they were technically never capable of acting as a reliable stopping point because they actuate down by default, say if there is a power outage and wouldn't be able to stop a train. But with the brake area now being a full-on block zone, this became a stacking position for trains, and also meant trains could launch more often, since they only had to wait for the brake block to clear and not for the rear station block to clear. It lowered the minimum time between each launch from 60 to 56 seconds, meaning 64 trains could theoretically launch an hour compared to 60. The new mode only used the front station position to unload and load trains, and there was the option to use right station 1 or left station 1. However, the left station was almost never used since the right station had the ADA ramp, which made the attraction accessible to everyone. Interestingly, the new mode worked well in the years that Ka and Zumanjaro Drop of Doom could not run simultaneously, probably much better than normal mode would have. That's the version of Kingda Ka I worked as a ride operator in 2015, and 36 trains an hour was our theoretical maximum with the limitation of Zumanjaro. But the big push to run Ka with 3 trains was to reduce the number of staff it took to run the ride at maximum capacity. So instead of 8 attendants, there were now 4 attendants staffed at the single load position. The park doubled the attendance at a single position in order to speed up the load time of each individual train. Now the drawbacks with 3 train operations were that 1, it made the station a lot less visually appealing, since 3 of the 4 load bays were just sitting empty and wasting space. I thought it always looked like an obvious budget cut, and the look of 4 train operations gave the ride a much more grand aura. It also took a lot more work for the ride crew to dispatch trains as fast as 4 train operations did, since there was little time to unload and load each train. Even with a really good crew, they would often stack the 3rd train in the brake block, simply because the ride cycle was that short, and the ride probably should have had multi-move added to it when 3 train operations became the new norm. It probably would have also helped if the rear station position became an unload station whenever the ride ran 3 trains, but when only running 2 trains, returned to unloading guests at the front station position. Over the years, the staffing at the ride seemed to drop from 4 attendants to just 2 attendants checking restraints. But even with just 2 attendants, the 2024 Ka crew proved that insane numbers are still possible. In the ride's final days, with just 2 attendants checking restraints, the ride crew dispatched 55 trains in a single hour with just 2 trains on the track, which is wild when you consider that that was an average hour when Ka ran 4 trains with 8 attendants. But all in all, I still found that 4 train operations were much superior to 3 train operations through a single station. While it required more staff and had its drawbacks, I really can't say it enough that 4 train operations was a visual spectacle, and more reliably dispatched trains to the launch track at a very quick pace. It also meant that ride attendants did not have to rush, and that good rider numbers could be achieved in almost any circumstance. The sad part is that Great Adventure allegedly had plans to bring back 4 train operations by 2026. On top of that, Ka would have allegedly been restored in 2026 with a fresh paint job, a refresh of the ride area, and a rebuild of much of the hydraulic room which powers its launch. But Cedar Fair, Six Flags, ruled with their iron fist and made sure that didn't happen. This multi-record breaking launch coaster, which is apparently going to replace 5 rides, better be absolutely mind-blowing and monumental, as myself and so many others are honestly pissed and heartbroken. It's something that we'll most likely never forget, and it's going to take a lot for us to forgive corporate. I have absolutely no ill feelings feelings towards Six Flags Great Adventure and shouts out to their awesome park president, Brian Basica. I think he'll continue to take Great Adventure in the right direction as long as corporate lets him. But that will do it for this in-depth video covering the fabled 4 train operations on the former Kingda Ka at Six Flags Great Adventure. Comment below if you got to witness 4 train operations. I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope it taught you something new. Be sure to like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe for more nerdy content just like this. I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.